Okay, we are here to do a little review for your Unit 11 test this week. Make sure that you follow along with the study guide. This will help you get that extra credit for the last unit test. Some topics to know with the civil rights movement. Remember, the goal of the civil rights movement is going to be to eliminate segregation and expand voting rights. When we see an action going towards eliminating segregation, the case to know is Brown versus Board of Education. Remember, in Brown versus Board of Education, we reversed that decision that was separate but equal that came from Plessy versus Ferguson, and now we are seeing a desegregation of the schools. We know that not everyone wanted to desegregate the schools, and one of the examples of the resistance to it was the Little Rock Nine, where President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to escort those 9 students in Arkansas. As Commander-in-Chief, Eisenhower has the power to send in these federal troops to escort the students, showing his support for the desegregation of schools. A name to associate with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is Martin Luther King Jr. He is going to be known for his work in the beginning with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He is known best for his support of nonviolent protest in the form of civil disobedience. An example of a nonviolent protest is a sit-in, where we would have people going to places that were supposed to be segregated and simply sitting in to prove the ridiculousness, really, of the segregation within public facilities. Some achievements of the civil rights movement that come after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and also the assassination of John F. Kennedy are going to be the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made those restrictions on voting illegal at the federal level. So now you cannot have poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause put in place to stop the execution of the 15th Amendment. You also have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was meant to outlaw those discrimination practices within the South. When it comes to the presidency of John F. Kennedy, there are a few big pieces that we want to remember. John F. Kennedy is going to inherit that policy of containment. Remember, we're containing the spread of communism. One of the actions that he took to do so was the Bay of Pigs invasion. Remember, we were trying to overthrow Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba fails, and it increases tensions with the Soviet Union. It leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, those 6 days where the Soviets put the missiles within Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and threatened to fire them at the United States. Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we are going to take steps to relax the tensions to avoid nuclear war. We passed what was called the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Remember, we said we could not test those nuclear weapons above ground. We put the hotline in place between the United States and the Soviet Union so that the leadership of both of those major powers could talk to each other instead of getting closer to a nuclear war. Some other examples of containment during Kennedy's presidency was Alliance for Progress. Remember, that was us trying to help Latin America avoid those communist revolutions. And Kennedy is also going to establish the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was when we were sending people throughout the world, really, to communities that were in need, and we would help them build up their communities. We would help them build schools. We would help them organize governments, really just help them become democratic societies that were successful and self-sufficient, that had improved economies. Lyndon B. Johnson. When we talk about Johnson, we need to know that he is responsible for the Great Society. The Great Society declared that war on poverty. Remember, this is where we get Medicare, Medicaid. We talked about the program of Head Start in here, really trying to help the people that are suffering within the country. One of the reasons that the Great Society does not achieve that war against poverty was because of the war in Vietnam. The war is going to be very expensive in Vietnam and pulls away from the funding for the programs that Johnson wanted to use to get rid of poverty. When we talk about Johnson in Vietnam, we have to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that essentially gave the president unrestricted powers in Vietnam to make decisions without Congress kind of tripping him up. But remember, we never declare war in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution helps us basically fight a war without a declaration of war. That Gulf of Tonkin resolution is going to be reversed by the War Powers Act in 1973. That is where we see the limits for the commander-in-chief being put back into place and really clearing up what the president can and cannot do when there is no declaration of war. Johnson is going to be heavily criticized for increasing the tensions in Vietnam. This is where, during Johnson's presidency, really in the 1960s, we see the protests vamping up in the United States. A lot of student protests on college campuses. We're going to see protests through music. Artists like Bob Dylan are going to come out with songs against the war. The reason that Johnson is going to say he expanded this war is going to be for the policy of containment. He says we had to be involved in Vietnam in order to contain the threat of communism. The Warren Court is also going to be something that you find on your test. During the time that Chief Justice Earl Warren served on the court, he used a lot of the decisions to expand the rights of the accused. Remember, the accused are people who are arrested of crimes, and it's really expanding the rights of the individual as well. The rights that are already within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, just making sure that we know what they are defined as through Supreme Court decisions. The Warren Court is known as the most liberal court in history, and it's often compared to the Marshall Court that we talked about all the way in the beginning of the year. The Marshall Court, remember, really went through the Constitution with a fine-tooth comb and defined what the powers of the federal government were versus the state government. And here again, we have a Supreme Court going through the Constitution with a fine-tooth comb and explaining to the people what their rights are. So both courts really just explained to us what was in the Constitution for us to understand. Cases that you would see in multiple choice questions to go with the Warren Court would be Miranda versus Arizona, that gives us the Miranda rights. Mapp versus Ohio, which tells us that the police need a warrant to use evidence and to search for evidence. Protects us from unreasonable search and seizure. And then Gideon versus Wainwright, which is the case that tells us you have the right to an attorney no matter what crime you commit. Some miscellaneous ideas to know that you'll find on your test. First, we need to remember the suburbs. The suburbs really developed after World War II because of the GI Bill. Remember, the GI Bill was put into place to help our soldiers after World War II kind of reacclimate to life, giving them support with money as far as being able to go back to college, start a business, get a home. And as we see the population of the suburbs growing, we had to build the highway system. Remember, the Interstate Highway Act is going to be a result of the growth of the suburbs. Also, just some miscellaneous, the space race. Remember, the space race gets started when the Soviets launched Sputnik up into space. We then are racing to get to the moon, putting a lot of money into NASA spending. JFK, remember, famously said we'll have a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and we did when we see Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969. A couple of things about Nixon that you may find on your test and on the Regents. The idea of détente. Remember, Nixon's policy of détente was that we need to reduce these tensions with Cold War countries, or the countries that we were fighting against in the Cold War, really specifically the Soviet Union, China, that we don't have to be at odds with them, that there is a way for us to coexist peacefully and even work together in order to support each other's economy. One of the examples of this détente is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is exactly what it says it is. SALT is an agreement between the United States and other Cold War countries that we would limit our arms. It's the opposite of the nuclear arms race, right? This is us saying that we don't need to have the most biggest weapons, or be in this competition at least to have the most biggest weapons, because ultimately that competition, if a war were to start, would lead to ultimate destruction here in the United States and around the world, now that we've learned a little about the tensions there. One thing I forgot to put on our PowerPoint is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That book would end up on this slide here for miscellaneous to know. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, remember, is about the impact of DDT, that pesticide that had been found to be negatively impacting our environment, which will ultimately lead us to putting in place environmental protections so that we start looking at what happens to the environment with all that we have been doing. Kind of attaches to this idea of nuclear weaponry as well, because we had been testing so many nuclear bombs. And Rachel Carson really points us to environmental protections from the government. All right, any questions, you guys let me know. Good luck.